People pass through parks every day. They walk the trails, admire the view, then eventually go home. But on one old bench at Inspiration Point, someone has been watching them leave for a very long time. This story is part fiction, part personal, and a reminder that there is a light at the end of every tunnel. Welcome to Tooth and Talon. Jane couldn't remember how long she'd been wandering. Years, certainly. Decades, perhaps. Time had become difficult to measure when there was nowhere she needed to be. In the beginning, she had searched. For what, she couldn't say. She only knew there was something she was supposed to find. The feeling had been strong once, strong enough to keep her moving from place to place, always believing that eventually she would see something, or someone, and understand why she was still here. She never did. Eventually, Jane stopped believing she would. One afternoon, she found herself walking along a trail at Inspiration Point in Roman Nose State Park. Families passed her. A young couple walked together, their hands intertwined. An older man stopped occasionally to take photographs. Somewhere nearby, children laughed and shouted to one another. Jane watched them for a while. Then she noticed the bench. She was tired. She knew she didn't need to be. Whatever she was now didn't require sleep or rest. Still, she felt tired. So Jane sat down. She didn't get up again. Days passed, then months, then years. Jane watched people come and go. She came to recognize some of them. Families who returned every summer. Couples who visited once and never returned. Children who appeared year after year, each time a little taller than before. The children were her favourite. Jane had always loved children. She watched them chase one another down the trails. She laughed when they argued over things that seemed terribly important for 5 minutes, and were forgotten 5 minutes later. Occasionally, one would do something that reminded her of John. Her son had been like that, especially when there was a fishing pole nearby. Sometimes someone would stop in front of Jane's bench and look directly toward her. Those moments always caught her by surprise. Jane would straighten. For just a moment she would wonder, "Can you see me?" Then the person would point towards something beyond her, a tree, the view, a bird sitting on a branch. Whatever brief hope Jane had felt disappeared. They weren't looking at her. They were looking through her. Eventually she stopped getting excited when it happened. Then, one afternoon, a ball came bouncing down the trail. It bounced once, twice, then rolled to a stop a few feet from Jane's shoes. A little boy came running after it. He couldn't have been more than 6. He scooped up the ball, tucked it under one arm and stood. Then he looked directly at Jane. "Hello." Jane stared at him. The boy waited. Jane said nothing. His brow furrowed. "Mummy says it's rude not to say hello back when somebody says hello to you." Jane blinked. Hello?" The boy smiled. Jane leaned forward. "You can see me?" He looked confused by the question. "Of course I can see you." He pointed at the bench. "You're sitting right there." Jane stared at him. Then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Jane began to laugh. The boy laughed too, although Jane suspected he had no idea what was funny. "What's your name?" she asked. "David." "That's a nice name." "What's yours?" "Jane." David nodded, apparently satisfied with the exchange. He climbed onto the bench beside her, set his ball in his lap, and looked out over the park. Jane watched him. She had forgotten what it was like to have someone sit beside her. People used the bench all the time, of course. They sat exactly where David was sitting now. Some had even sat where Jane herself sat, completely unaware of her presence. But this was different. David knew she was there. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked. Jane smiled. "A very long time." "Since this morning?" he asked. "A little longer than that," she replied. "Yesterday?" Jane laughed softly. Longer. David considered this. After a pause, he said, "A week?" "Much longer," she said as she winked at him. His eyes widened. "A year?" "Many years." David looked at her as if she'd just told him she'd been sitting there since dinosaurs walked the earth. "Why?" Jane looked down at her hands. "I suppose I got tired of looking." "For what?" "I don't know." David frowned. Jane smiled at him. "It doesn't make much sense, does it?" "No." Jane laughed again. "No, I suppose it doesn't." They talked, about nothing important at first. David told her he was 6 years old. He told her about school and a boy in his class who could make a farting noise with his armpit. He told her his favourite colour, changed his mind halfway through explaining why, and then informed her that his favourite colour was actually light blue. Jane listened to every word. She asked questions. Sometimes David answered them. Sometimes her questions reminded him of something completely unrelated, and off he went again. Jane didn't care. She had spent years surrounded by voices that were never speaking to her. Now one was. "David!" a woman called from further down the trail. David turned. "That's my mum." A woman stood in the distance looking around for him. "I have to go." Jane's smile faltered. "Oh." David jumped down from the bench and tucked the ball beneath his arm. For a moment Jane wanted to ask him to stay just a little longer. She didn't. "Goodbye, David." He took several steps before stopping. Then he turned around. "I'll come back." Jane smiled. Children made promises easily. "That would be nice." "I will," he said while crossing his heart. His mother called again. David ran toward her. Jane watched until he disappeared down the trail. The park seemed quieter after he was gone. Jane sat alone. The following day she found herself watching the trail. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him. David had said he would come back, but he was 6. 6-year-olds promise many things. Several days passed. Jane stopped watching quite so closely. Then one afternoon she heard running footsteps. "Jane!" David came charging down the trail toward her. Jane stood before she realized what she was doing. "You came back." David looked at her. "I told you I would." David climbed onto the bench. "What did you do while I was gone?" Jane looked around. "The same thing I always do." "That sounds boring." "It can be." David thought about that. Then he grinned. "Want to hear what happened at school?" Jane sat back down beside him. "I would love to." And so it began. Whenever David came to the park, he visited Jane. Sometimes he stayed for an hour, sometimes only a few minutes, but he always came. As the years passed, the little boy grew taller. His stories changed with him. The armpit noises and playground arguments eventually became teachers, tests, and girls. One afternoon, David dropped onto the bench beside her with a scowl. Jane looked over. "What happened to you?" "Nothing." "David?" "Nothing." Jane waited. She had learned years ago that sometimes the fastest way to get David talking was to stop asking. It worked. After a moment, David sighed. "There's this girl." Jane smiled. David immediately pointed at her. "Don't." "I didn't say anything." "You were going to." "I was doing no such thing. You had the look." "What look?" "That look." Jane folded her hands innocently in her lap. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." David stared at her for another moment. Then he laughed. Years later, David came to her carrying an envelope. He was a young man now. He sat beside her but said nothing. Jane glanced at the envelope. "Well?" David tried to hide his smile. "I got in." Her face brightened. "You did?" David nodded. "College." Jane hugged him before remembering that she couldn't. Her arms passed through him. David shivered. "That's still weird." Sorry. No, you're not. Jane smiled. No, I'm not. He held up the letter. I leave in August. Jane's smile remained, but David knew her too well. I'll come back. David, you don't have to. I said I'll come back. Jane looked at the young man sitting beside her. For just a moment she could still see the 6-year-old with the ball tucked beneath his arm. I know you will. And he did. College became law school became long hours and cases David complained about, but refused to discuss in any useful detail, because, as he repeatedly reminded Jane, some things were confidential. Jane found this irritating. You've spent 20 minutes complaining about a man you refused to tell me anything about. Attorney-client privilege. Then complain about someone else. David laughed. Eventually he walked into the park wearing a suit. Jane stared at him as he approached. What? Nothing? You're staring. You look very handsome. David straightened his tie. Well, I am an attorney now. Jane looked him over, then she sighed. Oh dear. What? Jane shook her head. All that power in your hands. David laughed and sat beside her.
The years continued. David brought his problems to the bench. He brought his victories too. Jane listened to all of them. Sometimes she offered advice. Sometimes David ignored it. Sometimes he returned months later and admitted she had been right. Jane enjoyed those visits most of all. You could try saying that again, she'd tell him. I said you were right. I didn't quite hear you. Yes, you did. Jane smiled innocently. I'm very old, David. You're also lost. Jane glared at him. David grinned, and eventually they both laughed. Jane shared her stories too. She told him about John, her son, and how the boy had loved to fish. She told him about her daughter, Anne, about Elaine, her stepdaughter, and she told him about her granddaughter, Tessa. Whenever Tessa came up, something changed in Jane's expression. She was the sweetest little thing, Jane told him once. You've said that before. Well, she was. I believe you. Jane looked out over the park. I wonder what became of her. David didn't have an answer, so he simply sat beside her. There were lighter stories too, there always were. One afternoon David arrived looking genuinely offended. Jane recognized the expression immediately. What happened? My son-in-law insulted my hamburgers. Jane stared at him. Your hamburgers? He said they were dry. Jane raised an eyebrow. How dry? David scoffed. As dry as hockey pucks. Jane tried not to laugh. She failed. Oh, that's not funny. It is a little funny. I make good hamburgers. I'm sure you do. You don't even eat. That doesn't mean I can't have an opinion. David shook his head. I came here for sympathy. Jane gave a dismissive little wave. Pshaw, you've come to the wrong bench. David tried to remain offended. He lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then he started laughing too. Those were the visits Jane loved most. Not because anything important happened, but because nothing had to. More years passed. Jane noticed the grey beginning at David's temples before he did. At least that was what she claimed. David disagreed. I've had grey hair for years. No, you haven't. Yes, I have. David, I look at you more than you look at you. That doesn't even make sense. It makes perfect sense. David shook his head. You're getting argumentative in your old age. Jane turned slowly and stared at him. David smiled. Sorry. No, you're not. Yeah, you got me. I'm not. Jane laughed. Some things between them never changed. Others did. David had married. He had children. The children grew up and eventually had families of their own. Jane heard about all of them. She knew who was doing well in school, who had gotten into trouble,
who had married someone David wasn't particularly fond of, and who had given him grandchildren. Sometimes Jane had to remind him that he had complained just as much about his own parents when he was young. David usually denied this. Jane usually remembered otherwise. There were birthdays, anniversaries, promotions, funerals, good years and bad ones. Sometimes David arrived smiling before he ever reached the bench. Other times Jane could tell from the way he walked that something was wrong. On those days, she didn't ask immediately. She waited. David always told her eventually. As he grew older, he began walking more slowly. At first Jane teased him about it. Then came the limp. It wasn't terrible in the beginning. David dismissed it whenever she asked. "I'm fine." "You're limping." "I'm getting old." "I noticed." "Thank you for stating the obvious." "You're welcome," she said. He rolled his eyes. Jane smiled. But she worried.
The visits became less frequent. Not suddenly. There was no single day when things changed. There was simply more time between them. A week became 2. 2 became 3. Sometimes a month passed before Jane saw him coming down the trail. She began watching for him again, just as she had when he was 6. Whenever he finally appeared, though, the waiting was forgotten. One afternoon, Jane spotted him coming down the trail. "About time." David raised a hand. "I have a life, you know." "So you've been telling me for the last 70 years. David reached the bench and lowered himself onto it with a tired groan. Jane looked him over. His hair had gone completely white. Deep lines now surrounded his eyes. The boy who had once come running after a ball had become an old man. Jane remained unchanged. David leaned back and let out a long breath. "Getting old is a terrible idea. I don't recommend it." Jane smiled. "I wouldn't know." David looked at her. "Show off." Jane laughed. They sat quietly for a while. Jane had learned to appreciate the quiet between them. When David was young, he could barely sit still long enough to finish one story before beginning another. Now sometimes he came simply to sit. Jane didn't mind. She liked having him there. After a while, David looked out over the park. "You know, I think we've talked about just about everything there is to talk about." Jane considered it. "I don't think you've ever properly apologized for doubting my advice about that girl when you were 16. David groaned. "That was 60 years ago." "And yet I remember." "Of course you do." "I was right." "You usually are." Jane turned toward him. "Usually?" David smiled. "Don't push it." Jane laughed. When it was time for him to leave, David placed both hands on his knees and pushed himself to his feet. He stood still for a moment before reaching for his cane. Jane watched him. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You always say that." "And one of these days you're going to believe me." "I doubt it." David smiled down at her. "I'll see you next time, Jane." She smiled back. "I'll be here." "I know." David turned and started down the trail. Jane watched him go. His steps were slow. The limp was worse than it had been the last time. For reasons she couldn't explain, Jane wanted to call after him. She almost did. Instead, she watched until he disappeared from sight. Then she waited. A few days passed. David didn't come. Jane wasn't concerned. A week passed. Still nothing. She watched the trail more often. Another week. Then another. A month passed. Jane stopped pretending she wasn't worried.
Every time she saw an older man approaching in the distance, she straightened. Every time it was someone else. She began listening for the familiar tap of his cane against the trail. It never came. Another month passed. Jane knew. She didn't know how she knew. She simply did. David wasn't coming back. For a while, Jane stopped paying attention to the park. People passed in front of her. Families came and went. Children laughed. Dogs pulled impatiently at their leashes. Jane barely noticed any of them. Eventually, the old routine returned. She watched. There wasn't much else to do. One afternoon, 2 children were playing near the trail. A little girl was chasing a boy who had apparently stolen something from her. "Give it back!" The boy laughed and ran faster. Despite herself, Jane smiled. The girl caught him. There was a brief wrestling match, followed by an argument that neither seemed particularly committed to winning. Jane shook her head. Children. She watched them for another moment. Then she heard a voice from her right. "Jane?" Her smile disappeared. Jane froze. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned her head. David stood several yards away. He smiled. Then he raised one hand and waved. Jane stared at him. "David?" "Hello, Jane."
Jane stood. For the first time in months, she didn't have to think about it. She simply stood. David started toward her. Jane's eyes filled with tears. Her voice trembled. "I thought you weren't coming back." "I told you I always would." Jane let out a small laugh through her tears. Then she noticed something. David wasn't using his cane. She looked down at his legs as he approached. There was no limp. His steps were easy, comfortable. Jane looked back at his face. He was still David, still the old man she had last watched disappear down the trail, but the pain she had grown accustomed to seeing in his movements was gone. David stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David looked at the bench. "You know, we've always sat on this bench." Jane smiled. "We have." David looked down the trail. "Let's go somewhere." Jane's smile faltered. "What?" "Let's go somewhere." She stared at him. "David, I can't." "Yeah, you can." Jane shook her head. "No, I can't. I've been here too long." David held out his hand. Jane looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Come on." "David." "Yeah, you can." His hand remained outstretched. "Come on." Jane hesitated. Then she slowly reached for him. Their fingers touched. Jane gasped. She pulled back slightly, but David gently closed his hand around hers. Jane stared at their joined hands. She could feel him, actually feel him. Her fingers tightened around his hand. She brought her other hand up and touched the back of his. Solid. Jane ran her fingers across his knuckles. "David." He waited. Jane looked into his eyes. "How?" She squeezed his hand again. "How is this possible?" David smiled. "That doesn't matter." He gently pulled her toward him. "Come on, let's go." Jane took a step, then stopped. Her eyes widened. David waited. Jane looked down at her feet, then back toward the bench. She had moved away from it. For the first time in decades, Jane stood several feet from the place where she had given up searching. David gave her hand a gentle tug. Jane took another step, then another. A laugh escaped her. David laughed with her. Together they reached the trail. David looked in one direction, then the other. "Where do you want to go?" Jane stared down the trail. "I don't know."
She looked around at the park she had watched for so many years. "It's been so long." David smiled. "Well, let's just see what this side of the world has in store for us." Jane looked at him, then she smiled. Hand in hand, they started down the trail. Jane didn't look back at the bench. This time, she had no reason to.